This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a market intelligence company helping clients achieve resilient, competitive advantage in the long term.
Basically, any purpose that's a profitable solution to the problems of people and the planet, according to that notion of profit, is legitimate and desirable.
Welcome to the Future and Sound podcast. I'm your host, Jen Wilson. This is a podcast where we talk about prioritizing people, planet, and profit in business strategy and decision making. You'll have different names for this: ESG strategy, sustainability strategy, maybe integrated strategy. Whatever glossy terms you choose, if you're in the thick of this stuff, you know there's no silver bullet. Like in any strategy, you can't prioritize everything, so there are trade-offs and different views to consider. In this podcast, we learn from world-leading experts who share bits of wisdom that can help us see the future we want and our role in it. This isn't a normal business podcast. We're not interested in the latest trend, jargon, or branding technique. Instead, we go beyond the headlines and look to clarify our long-term view on resilient economies, competitive business strategies, and decision-making best practice. This is episode 2, On Purpose. Quick story. In my last job, I was responsible for leading strategic planning for a group of companies that engineers and manufacture steel bridges for customers around the world. I remember getting ready to give a presentation for the board of this group of companies, and I was standing next to my colleague, Kevin. We're both a bit nervous, but I know I've got an expert by my side, and we're ready to go. So we go in, we make our pitch, it's well received, and board members ask some really great questions. One of the questions that came up was, what do we mean by sustainability? Is it about the financial sustainability of a company? Is it about ecological sustainability? Is it about being able to serve your employees over the long term? What does it really mean? So Kevin and I leave the boardroom. We literally give each other a high five on our way out, feeling pretty good about things. But what stuck with me is that definitions are really important. This story with Kevin and I presenting to the board brings me to the topic of this episode, which is about defining purpose for a corporation. Earlier this summer, I had a fascinating discussion with Professor Colin Mayer. He's one of the leading experts on corporate purpose. He's a fellow at the British Academy, where he leads the Future of the Corporation initiative, which essentially takes research from all different fields, combines it together, and pairs it with insights from senior business and policy leaders in order to map a path forward. He also recently wrote a book called Prosperity, which clarifies how a renewed vision of the corporation can create both economic and social well-being. In this interview, Colin and I talk about the future role of the corporation, why it's changing, what decision makers in business can do to deepen the purpose in their organizations, and much more. It is an honor to welcome you, Colin, onto our podcast today.
Well, Jen, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor to do this.
So my understanding is that you started your academic career researching mergers and acquisitions, regulation, taxation, and then you turned your focus to the purpose of the corporation. I'm wondering, how did that come about?
Well, it was something that was actually of great interest to me right from the beginning, because I did a lot of work on financial systems and the financing of business. And one of the things I found very surprising when I started doing that was that people didn't really pose the question as to, well, what's a financial system there to do? What's its purpose and who's it trying to serve? And so then I began to look into that, and I shifted from just a focus on pure financing to the question of corporate governance. and the notion of the governance of companies. And when I did that, I realized that there was a similar problem, that basically people looked at corporate governance as being about boards, and that it was a question of the appropriate composition and functioning of different board members, but not really about the central role that corporate governance plays in terms of linking business together with the rest of an economy, and what function, again, it was supposed to perform. And then I went on and looked at issues around the evolution of business over time, and I started doing historical studies, and I noticed that there were significant developments in terms of the way in which people thought about the nature of business and the way in which business behaved and its role in society. So I became interested in that, and then I developed a lot of focus on international comparisons and observed that there were major differences in the way in which business was structured in different parts of the world. And people weren't really particularly focused on that topic, but it seemed to me to be very central to our understanding of the nature of business and the way in which it was supposed to be performing. And then the financial crisis hit. And suddenly people became very interested in all of these topics and started thinking in fairly fundamental ways about what had gone wrong with the financial system and what should it have done better. And then my focus really moved to this issue about the role of business in contemporary society. And that then became a focus of my research over the subsequent years, which is where we get to now.
I'm wondering, as you started to turn your focus to the purpose of business, asking the why question, how is that received at conferences, amongst other business professors? Was there quite a bit of pushback, or did you find people's interests were piqued?
No, varied a great deal. In some cases, they said, why the devil you are asking such a stupid question? It's obvious why business is there. It's there to make money for its shareholders. Or in economist terms, it was regarded as being a rather naive question, because basically business was viewed as being the handmaiden of an economy, that it just responded like an automaton to external stimuli, namely prices and markets. And so it didn't really have an independent life. And the financial system was furthermore the handmaiden of this handmaiden. It was just there to lubricate the wheels of an economy. It didn't actually perform any significant function on its own. So this whole notion of really trying to think about the reason why wasn't something that a lot of people were very willing to accept.
Colin, in your view, is there a particular trend that is elevating this discussion on corporate purpose?
Yes. It was Milton Friedman who said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that change occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. It's therefore our duty, he said, to produce new ideas, keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Now, that sums up very well basically what drives change in this area. It's driven by crises. And in essence, we have seen an increasing frequency and intensity of crises occurring, and we're going to see that happening going forward. And each time that these crises occur, there's a great deal of hand-wringing in terms of saying, oh, well, what have we done wrong? And what have we done to deserve this? Which then produces a rush to find these new ideas. So it's those that really have the greatest significance in terms of what is actually brought about and what changes.
One of the sentences that I've heard from you when you talk about, well, what does purpose really mean? And correct me if I'm wrong, it's to profitably solve problems related to people and planet, and to not profit from creating harm to people and planet. I'm wondering if, as you turn your mind to the next 5-10 years and what the future purpose of corporations look like, what do you think some of the fundamental trends will be? What do you think some of the changes will look like?
Okay, well, let's just step back a little bit before I answer that question and put purpose a little bit more in a context, because it's quite important to understand the notion of purpose that I have in mind before I try and answer the question about how it's likely to change in the future. The notion of purpose that I believe to be important is to think about it as being the fundamental reason for why a business exists, why it's created, its raison d'etre. And in essence, a way of thinking about that is that it's its North Star, its notion of becoming. What is it that an organization should become in a broad context? And the way in which I then suggest it's perhaps most helpful to think about that concept is in terms of businesses being there to solve problems. Indeed, my notion of purpose in general, in terms of the purpose of our lives, is very similar to that. That basically the purpose of the existence of any living organism or any institution that we might create is to solve problems of other parts of the universe. So the notion of solving problems is critically important. And in this context, the role of business is to help solve the problems that you and I as individuals, that we as societies, that the natural world face now and going forward, and to do so in a way that is commercially viable. And in that regard, the notion of profit is critically important. So the way in which I think about the purpose of a business is in terms of producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. But there's a second part to it that is critically important, and that is the notion of not profiting from producing problems for people or planet. And the reason why that is so important is that once one thinks in those terms about what is a justifiable profit, it automatically answers the question about, is there a relationship between success in delivering one's purpose and the financial performance of a firm? Because one has defined it that way. One's defined a profit as not being a profit if it creates harm. Therefore, in that sense, a profitable solution is by definition one that creates benefit without creating harm. So basically any purpose that's a profitable solution to the problems of people and the planet, according to that notion of profit, is legitimate and desirable. So let me now then turn to your question about what is going to develop going forward. So what in particular we're going to recognize is that the nature of the problems that we're facing are changing very rapidly. Now, why is that the case? The reason for that is not simply what people are predominantly focused on, and that is questions around climate change and issues like that. It's predominantly around the rate of technological change that is in progress. And that change in technical change is fundamentally altering not only the types of activities that businesses are undertaking, but also its potential to be a remarkable force for good in the world, but also a potential risk. Now, why is it the case that technology can be such a risk going forward? The answer to that is that it has an ability to really create unanticipated outcomes. And that is what we've observed in the past from major technological advances that have taken place in virtually every sphere of life. And what is really important then in thinking about the purpose of business going forward is how can it really use technology in such a way as to help us to solve problems without, as I'm saying, profiting from creating harms. Now, what that requires then is an ability for all of us, scientists, businesses, those investing in economies, to identify what are the potential things that can go wrong. Okay, and in essence, we're living through an example of that at present, insofar as what we're observing happening at the moment is that we are making, for example, at the moment, immense use of a new technology in the form of communication, which, as we can see at present, has been of tremendous advantage to us in terms of retaining some degree of communication. But there's a great risk in all technologies that in essence we lose control of them, that we lose our ability to actually manage these technologies. We've observed that happening with social networking, where in many cases social networking has taken over people's lives in a way in which they haven't been able to control in the way in which they wish to. Likewise, we're going to find that there are real risks associated with this technology insofar as it encourages, for example, home working, that it improves productivity, but at the expense of creating major psychological problems for people and greater degrees of isolation, etc. So one of the things that this illustrates is the importance of understanding the retention of the human element associated with technology. And that is difficult to do because in many respects, the commercial process drives one in the direction of seeking to gain the greatest efficiency from these technologies. And that often takes the form of essentially substituting for humans. And that will become increasingly significant because the machinery that we're developing has entered a completely new phase where it's not a matter of capital labor substitution that is going on, where we think about labor as being essentially manual labor. It is that the new technologies are replacing our mental capacities, not only just to process information, but to take decisions on the basis of it. So we're entering into a world in which increasingly we're going to find technologies essentially replacing us as humans, not just in terms of analyzing information, but also taking decisions. Now that pushes this notion of eliminating the human aspect of technology to its extreme, because it means that in essence, we lose control of the machines that we're operating. And that's not science fiction. That is science fact in the sense that we're already beginning to see that happen in a number of contexts. And we're going to, for example, it's being talked about as being used in making judicial decisions in courts of law. It potentially will actually enter the boardroom, not just in terms of helping directors to make decisions, but to make decisions for them. And the area where we've actually observed it already happening is in relation to financial markets, because program trading in financial markets is in essence machines taking decisions on our behalf about how to allocate financial resources. So the implication of that is this notion of purpose becomes particularly important when one thinks about these technological innovations that are in process, and the risk that we substitute out humans from controlling the technology and losing the humanity that's associated with that aspect. And one of the things we will have to place particular emphasis in notions of purpose is on the purpose of the algorithms that are being written for those machines to ensure that they do reflect what we as humans in society are looking for from our lives.
What are some of the questions that executives at the strategic planning table should be discussing related to the technology that they're creating. And before I let you answer that question, it does strike me that there's a time horizon question here. It's not just about how this technology will play a role in the next year, 2 years, etc. It's thinking about the context of the future and future iterations of the technology and the implications for people. So, yeah, I'm wondering what kinds of questions should they be asking themselves?
Well, you're posing it in exactly the right way, and that is, in essence, what one is observing is an acceleration of the process by which the creation of new technologies is accelerating so rapidly. So we're essentially moving into higher levels of derivatives at the rate of change that's occurring, and in essence, this is a question about consciousness as to where the consciousness about the decisions that are made about these things are taken, and what a lot of the machinery that's in place at present is doing is basically providing far more effective mechanisms for processing huge quantities of data very quickly than we as humans are capable of, or probably ever will be capable of doing. So in essence, it's shifted our mental ability to control those, or it's eliminated our ability to control those, and made it important that we go to the next stage of saying, right, well, how do we then think about the development of the processes that are going to come out of that huge amount of data information that we're gathering? So in essence, what's required is that we as humans need to ensure that our consciousness is always one step ahead of any machine algorithm and anything that machine algorithm can do. Let me just take an example of a company that I think is thinking very constructively about this, and that is Microsoft, which is obviously right at the forefront in terms of technological developments in the computing space, where Satya Nadella has set out very clearly what he thinks Microsoft should be doing in terms of addressing a problem that computing is creating in terms of the environment, global warming, because the energy consumption that computing involves, CO2 emissions, et cetera, and setting out a very clear notion as to what should be the way in which Microsoft overcomes that particular type of problem. Okay? And what's striking about that is the way in which he has specified a clear set of targets against which Microsoft's performance in this area is going to be measured. Okay, so that is an example of how an organization can think in a very coherent and clear fashion about a particular problem that needs to be mitigated in some way. But then, if one thinks about the role that Microsoft is going to be performing in terms of creating these machines going forward, actually, its potential role is much more than just avoiding the negative. That's the second part of my notion of purpose, not profiting from producing problems, but also in terms of positive element, in terms of solving problems. Okay, so let's stick to this notion of CO2 emission. Well, one of the things that is going to significantly influence our ability to be able to solve the emissions problem is the extent to which companies are going to be able to effectively control their processes and control the extent to which they are generating CO2 emissions and identifying the best alternative procedures for them to employ. Now, that's something to which computing systems are clearly potentially extremely valuable forms of support to business, so that by taking that as an objective, not only to solve the problem in Microsoft itself, but how does Microsoft then help to solve other companies' problems? Satya Nadella has set out that as being a very important element of what, in a positive sense, Microsoft should be thinking about doing going forward as well.
And I understand that Satya Nadella was inspired by your book Prosperity, so maybe he's a good case study because he's been reading the right things, Colin. I do have a question related to stakeholder capitalism. It's taking a bit of a step back, but stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. So, you're talking about technology companies thinking about their impact on humanity and potential collaboration within their industry to ensure that positive impact happens. But devil's advocates might say, or I understand that you were having a debate with Professor Bebchuk from Harvard's law school about this very question. Devil's advocates might say, well, actually, that's up to the regulators. Governments are there to protect humanity or think about people and planet. When you look across all the various arguments that you could make against that notion, what's the first that comes to mind that you usually share?
Well, let me stick on the trajectory that we've just been taking, namely technology, and just take the point that I've just been making, that the rate of change of technology is going up rapidly, and there is no possibility whatsoever that regulation can effectively anticipate what's going to happen. Why? Simply because regulators are never going to be in the position of being as well informed as the companies that are making those technological investments and decisions. Now, regulation always lags behind the knowledge set that companies have, and that's been a major problem in terms of regulatory arbitrage and things like that. But that problem simply takes on orders of magnitude greater relevance in a context in which there is such a lag of or disparity in knowledge between regulators and companies as is created by technology. So the notion that one can, in essence, have an external body, and it's got nothing to do with the quality of the regulators or the well-meaning of those regulators. It is simply a problem that cannot be solved by regulation. And indeed, if you then say, okay, which is the normal response for people who advocate regulation, all we've got to do is just to intensify it and to enforce it better. That's what the inevitable consequence is going to be. You're going to have yesterday's regulation essentially suffocating technological innovation that is going to be beneficial, let alone failing to address those elements of the technological innovation that are really detrimental.
I'm wondering, as you look across different geographies, thinking about your view on purpose, are there certain parts of the world that just happen to be more aligned with what you're arguing should be the purpose of the corporation?
Yes, very much so. So one of the great insights that came from those international comparisons that I referred to earlier on was that business is done in very different ways. Not only is it done in different ways, it's structured in very different ways. So that in particular, one of the striking differences one observes across countries is the nature of the ownership of companies. And ownership is critically important in this regard, because ownership is, in an Anglo-American context of capitalism, viewed as being about the rights of shareholders. The rights of shareholders as in a form of property, that in essence, when you buy a share of a company, you're buying a share in an asset that confers on you property rights that are very similar to you owning a car, a washing machine, or a house. Now, that notion of property then influences the way in which the idea of a business is thought about, because it basically means that in the context of UK and US capitalism, it's regarded as essentially being about the right of a shareholder to extract the benefits associated from the investments that they've made in the firm, and the firm is then run for the benefit of their shareholders. Now, that notion of what a capitalist system is and the nature of ownership is very different from that in many, if not most, other countries around the world. Even if one goes across the English Channel from the UK to continental Europe, there is a dramatic shift, which is not unrelated to some of the political shenanigans that Britain is currently going through in relation to its relations with Europe, pronounced differences in the nature of the ownership of a corporation, where, first of all, there isn't the type of shareholding structure that one observes in the UK, but more significantly, the notion of the reason for the existence of a company is not just about the property right of the shareholders. It's also a notion about the responsibility of business and the responsibility of a business to other parties in the firm. So coming back to the stakeholder-shareholder debate, the notion of whether a company is just run for its shareholders or has obligations to its other stakeholders is something that shows really significant variations across countries. Now, to answer your question about whether or not I think that there's a particularly good illustration, well, if there is one country in the continent of Europe which I think illustrates what I'm talking about particularly well, and that is Denmark, because Denmark has a particular type of company that is observed in some other countries, but is particularly prevalent in Denmark, and that is what is termed an industrial foundation. It's a company that has a foundation, which is philanthropic in nature, but it's not just a foundation that gives away the money of those who've set up the company. It's a foundation that actually owns the company. And there are many examples of that. Bertelsmann, Bosch, Carlsberg, IKEA, Velux, and there's a well-known Indian example of it, namely Tata. Why that model is particularly interesting in the context of what I'm just talking about is that it illustrates the notion that the ownership of a company does not necessarily have to reside in those who are predominantly or exclusively interested in financial benefit. The reason why those industrial foundations were established to own companies was that the founders of those firms concluded for one reason or another that they did not want to pass on those companies to their descendants. Perhaps because they didn't have children, because they didn't think that they were competent in running their businesses, or perhaps because they didn't like their children. For one reason or another, they decided that they instead wanted to put them into foundations. Now, the establishment of those foundations was on the basis that they had purposes in running the businesses that they inherited and values that underpinned the running of those businesses, which reflected those of the founders. So in essence, it's a way of perpetuating the motivations and purposes that led to the original formation of those companies by the founders. And that has two elements that's associated with it. It clearly reflects the notion of the purpose of business as being more than just financial return driven. But secondly, it also gives a very long-term perspective, namely the foundation that is there essentially in perpetuity to own and oversee the running of the company. So it gives a very different perspective from systems in which the ownership is in the hands of what are often very short-term shareholders, predominantly focused on financial performance.
It's fascinating, this idea that values can be captured within an organization's structure and governance so that it lasts beyond the founders. I actually have recently moved from North America to the UK, as you know, Colin, and when I first landed, I found an Airbnb in the Hampstead Garden suburb in North London, which is an area of London that, as you allude to in your book, Prosperity, was originally developed by Henrietta Barnett, I believe. And she developed this community in order to ensure that individuals from different classes would live together. And of course, a 5-minute walk away from where I was staying is a street called Bishop's Avenue, which is also known as Billionaires Row. And I remember rereading that portion of your book and also thinking about, where we are today versus the initial intention behind the creation of the suburb, and how important this idea of maintaining purpose over time is. And with that in mind, my next question for you, Colin, is, obviously you're a scholar who's looked at purpose into history, far back into history, and I'd love to get your view on, have there been particular points in time where there was better balance in terms of purpose, or where we sort of had things going right and then we just lost our way?
Well, let's start off by saying that there wasn't a golden age when the corporation was a faultless, angelic organization. And indeed, in many respects, it started off in a fairly brutal fashion, or in its early manifestations, it was really very brutal in nature. But I think what perhaps is more instructive in nature is to appreciate the islands of inspiration that existed in this sea of murkiness and corruption. Because a period in which this prevailed in a particularly serious way in Britain, as was documented very clearly by Charles Dickens, was during the Victorian era, when there was terrible exploitation of child labour, slavery, whatever. There were, though, some shining examples of companies that took a very different route. Companies like Cadbury, which was associated with something similar to what you were describing in relation to Hampstead Garden Suburbs, namely creating a community in Birmingham, with companies like Rowntree, Boots, Beecham, Rickett, Coleman, Terry's, Fry's. All of them, or nearly all of them, were Quaker-owned companies. And the Quaker ideas that prevailed within the families was very much reflected in the way in which those companies ran their businesses, which was on the basis of supporting their employees through housing them, through building towns and villages for them to live in, supporting their local communities and the societies within which they were operating, and also, in many cases, providing significant benefits in terms of the health and well-being of people. Now, the importance of that is that it's in particular in circumstances in which business as a whole is malfunctioning, that the leading lights of inspiration are so important, because they, in essence, can influence the change that is needed to correct the vast mass of companies that are malfunctioning. And that was very much the influence that the Quaker families had. And I'll give you one illustration of this, and that is that one of the most significant influences that they had was on the introduction of the notion of fixed prices. It used to be the case that everyone used to have to barter and haggle for the way in which they bought and sold commodities, just as one does and one often enjoys doing when one goes around different parts of the world.
My mother is amazing at this, Colin. I always have to have her there with me when we're bartering. Sorry, go on.
But quite rightly, the Quaker families recognized that although this was something that could be of benefit to certain parties, many people were seriously exploited by that. And the notion that prevailed in Quaker thinking was that everyone is equal in the face of God. And they're equal in the face of God in the marketplace as well as anywhere else. And that therefore it is our duty as humans to treat everyone on an equal and fair basis. And that is true of the way in which one trades with people as well as treats them in other respects. And so the notion of a fixed prices against haggling was an idea of trying to ensure that everyone was equal in the marketplace as well as elsewhere. So, and that then became the accepted way of undertaking business in many parts of the world.
And I think that all of these examples, whether they relate to purpose in the past or corporate purpose in Denmark versus America or the UK, they do really underscore the idea that if we feel that the purpose of business is fixed, it really is not. It is something that we as humans construct, meaning that we can also shift that purpose to meet the ends that we're aiming for. And my next set of questions have to do with the individual. So many members of the audience are going to be working for businesses or at least purchasing products from businesses. And I'm wondering if we focus on the former camp, so individuals, say, picture, Colin, I know the corporate purpose work that you've been doing is more focused on the operating environment for the corporation rather than specific actions, but I am going to ask you an action-related question. And if you imagine that you are working for a bank in the city in London or say in New York, you are a few steps away, a few promotions away, I should say, from being CEO of this bank, and you're reading the headlines on climate change, you're reading the headlines on inequality, you really care, and you want to think about how you can embed deeper purpose into your organization. What are some of the things that you would do, or you feel that one could do in order to bring purpose into one's work?
Well, the answer is that you can look and see what are the shining examples of such organizations that we observe currently in the world. What are the equivalent of the Quaker companies in 21st century Britain, Europe, and the rest of the world? And a good illustration that I often cite in the area of banking is the one of Handelsbanken, which is a Swedish bank that went through a crisis. It's also an illustration of Milton Friedman's proposition about crises. And out of that crisis came an idea of completely transforming the nature of the bank, the way in which it ran. From the traditional way of it being a very hierarchical bank run from the top to a bank that devolved decision-taking right down to the individual branches, so that the mantra of the bank was the branch was the bank. Now, why is that important? It's important as an illustration because it brings out, I think, what is the key element in terms of successful implementation of purpose. And that is the recognition of the human element in firms and recognizing humans as humans with their own purposes, where really the objective is to help people to attain their particular purposes. Okay? It's not about simply imposing a set of rules and incentives that encourage or force people to behave in particular ways. It's a way of how do you harness this tremendous creativity, this sense that everyone wants to have employment that they feel is meaningful, fulfilling, where they can feel very proud of what they're doing, a sense of dignity, and where they feel that they've got a purpose to what they're doing. And that comes from empowering people throughout an organization, not running them from the top. Now, of course, it is the role of the people at the top to set the purpose or at least to help identify what the purpose is, and to ensure that the values of that purpose are reflected throughout the organization. And that is critical to being able to devolve decision-taking and control, because you're not doing it through a command and control mechanism. You're doing it through a mechanism of essentially narrative and persuasion. You're doing it through getting people to buy into a common purpose that prevails throughout the organization because they want to, not because it's forced upon them, because they really believe in it. And once you've done that, then of course you don't have to pull the strings every time and keep continuous oversight of what they're doing. You put trust in them. And that is perhaps the most important element of an organization in terms of what defines successful organizations in a financial sense, as well as in any other sense, as against unsuccessful. The notion of trust, because that's something that is seriously downplayed in economic and financial analysis, where it's all about incentives and performance-related outcomes. The notion of trust is one in which one is saying that even if one does not observe what someone else is doing, one knows that that other person will do, quote, the right thing, the thing that the purpose and the values of the organization set out and encourage people to do. Now, the reason why this then creates such commercial advantage for a bank or for any other organization is, well, obviously it creates more engaged, more motivated employees in the organization who want to contribute to what they're doing. But it also gives rise to a completely different relationship between the company and its customer and its other parties. Because take the example of a bank, and imagine yourself in a bank with a bank manager on the other side of the table, who you know is motivated almost entirely by their financial performance. Well, you know full well that really what they are predominantly interested in is how many products can they sell to you at the highest possible price. So there's a direct misalignment of interest, which inevitably prevails when one uses traditional incentive mechanisms, particularly in the context of financial institutions and areas which are basically about trading in money. There's a particular problem of aligning interests in that context through using financial incentives. If, on the other hand, you know that the predominant motivation of that purpose on the other side is to help solve your problems, in this context, in terms of how do they help to overcome the financial issues that you need to have addressed, then that creates a potential for a relationship of trust in which there is mutual respect on both sides. And that then creates a greater degree of loyalty on the part of customers and a willingness to retain custom with that particular bank. And therefore, it's not that the bank is profiting through selling products. It's profiting because its business is growing with the persons whose business it's financing. So it's a common interest that derives from aligning the relationship between the two parties so that it's a mutually beneficial relationship to both parties.
That example is so powerful. This idea that if a company is looking at a transaction just for the financial transaction, so much is lost in terms of trust. And I'm wondering if we come back to the example of the middle manager who's working for the bank, say, I'm interested in this idea of transformation. How do we create transformation from a transactional culture to one that's built on relationships and trust? And I'm wondering, if you were if you were that manager, say you have a team of 15, 30 people, just for argument's sake, and you're seeing that there's quite a bit of transactional behavior going on. Earlier, you mentioned that tapping into people's purpose is really important. How do you start to create that culture shift? What are some of the steps you can take to make movement?
Well, first of all, this is something one observes a great deal. So where purpose is enacted in companies, it tends to take two forms, one of which is it comes from the top insofar as that's what the owners, for example, in the industrial foundations, recognize as being important, or it comes from the board that comes to appreciate the importance of purpose, or it comes from experimentation and innovation elsewhere in the business. And so if you're managing a team of people where you know that there's some element of the business that is not working particularly well, that could be improved substantially, and you're given sufficient space in which to experiment, then one can help to bring about transformational change, not only within one's own part of the business, but in the business as a whole. And this is what is sometimes termed intrapreneurship, to draw a contrast or an analogy with entrepreneurship. It is innovation within large corporations that comes from recognition that there's a problem that a company is not solving, and that actually it's going to have to try and find alternative ways of experimenting to find the solution. Now, the way then in which that occurs is through that particular unit, or it's often a project within a company. It may be in a subsidiary of a firm in a particular part of the world, for example, in a developing part of the world where the issues that need to be solved are very different from what they are in the headquarters. What then is required is the two things that I was talking about. First of all, an identification of what is the nature of the product that can really help to bring about transformational change. And I'll give you an illustration of where that's been done. And that is in terms of thinking about how does one promote nutritious food in parts of the world where incomes are low, where the affordability of really nutritious food may be out of the reach of many families. Can you find a product that people want to eat, that's nutritious for them, and is really affordable by the bottom of the pyramid? And once you've identified that product, it comes on to the second element, which I said made this such an interesting, challenging area. And that is, well, how do you make it commercially viable? And that process of creating a commercially viable product often involves interacting with people, really understanding what determines how people make their purchasing decisions, what determines what a family does in terms of the food that it buys, what gets cooked for particular meals, and how can you inject into that process new forms of products that people are actually going to appreciate, fits into their lifestyles, etc., etc. You need to have a knowledge base that goes well beyond the standard capabilities of most, in particular, large corporations. And to solve that problem, they have to build partnerships with many other types of organizations, not just with other companies, but often with NGOs, with charitable organizations, with local authorities and national governments, to try and solve those particular problems, to get the knowledge set that's needed to provide the solutions. And that type of innovation is something that cannot be done from the top. It's another illustration of why running organizations in a hierarchical fashion is so damaging to their commercial performance, because you cannot have the knowledge set of what is required in the slums of Nairobi from sitting in a headquarters in New York or in London. And that is something then that the middle management of an organization are capable of solving. And if they're given the capacity to solve it, the space in which to do so, then it can have dramatic impacts on the performance of the company, and certainly very dramatic impacts on the societies in which they operate.
My final question for you, Colin, relates to where we're going next when it comes to purpose. So, of course, we've seen over the past maybe 20 years or so that it's clear that business has got to play a role in us achieving the most critical global goals that we have, or sustainable development goals, as set forth by the UN. 20 years ago, it was about the role of business in helping respond to imperatives set forth by Kyoto, etc. And we had, I think, the corporate social responsibility movement early on, which didn't really go far enough. We had a CSR person as part of larger organizations, but they might not have been invited to the strategic planning or the table or the boardroom table. And now if you say CSR, it's seen as something different than corporate purpose. And I'm just wondering, as we think about purpose and some of these ideas, not all purposes are the same, right? There's sort of skin deep commitment to purpose, and then there's deep commitment to purpose. And the importance of that is avoiding what some might call purpose washing. And as we think about the risk of purpose washing, I'm wondering if you can help us clarify, what is the difference in your view between a superficial commitment to purpose and a deep commitment to purpose? How can we tell the difference?
Yes, you can immediately tell whether a company is serious about what it's saying, and whether or not it's actually driving the business. So the notion of purpose washing is that in essence, it's a marketing ploy. Whereas what we're talking about here is purpose as the heart and core of the business, and reflected in the way in which it formulates its strategy, its values, and the culture of the organization. So it is what the company is. And that notion of what the company is and is becoming is then a very different idea from it's there to present the film to the outside world. Now, what is going to drive that change? Well, the change that has occurred is that purpose is no longer a question of whether or why we should be doing it, but what and how. And this notion then that purpose is about solving problems and not profiting from producing problems is, I think, the way in which it's going to be recognized as being more than just a current managerial fad. Some people say, oh, well, purpose is the terminology of the moment. We'll get over it and we'll move on to something else soon. But the idea that purpose is about the existence of something suggests that it's a bit more fundamental than that, and that it has a durability and a potential function to perform that is bigger than it just being another bit of managerial speak. And that's what I believe we will see happening going forward, that it's not just in relation to business that it's going to happen. And this is, I think, a very important element. In essence, we're moving beyond the recognition that this is about business. This is about how we run all of our organizations, public, private, philanthropic, social, etc. Why? Because in essence, this notion of them being driven by their purpose is a common feature. It should be a common feature. It should be clear to us when we interact with any government department, local authority, charitable organization, precisely what their purpose is and how their purpose is contributing to solving problems that business cannot or will not solve for us. So we are really just at the beginning of appreciating the significance of this notion of purpose in the context of business, and I think it has gained rapidly increasing recognition in the commercial world. But what will be even more significant, I think, going forward, is a recognition of it as a way of addressing questions about government, about international agencies, and indeed about addressing questions about international cooperation around the world. So I believe that we are potentially on a journey of establishing a purpose in our lives and all our institutions.
A journey that it has been such a pleasure discussing with you today, Professor Colin Mayer. I appreciate your time. I've really enjoyed the examples and the frameworks that you've shared with us today, and want to say a big thank you.
Thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Colin Mayer for joining us. I'd highly recommend his book, Prosperity: Better Business Makes the Greater Good. And you can learn more about his Future of the Corporation initiative on the British Academy website. Check out the links in our podcast description. The Future in Sound podcast is written and hosted by Jen Wilson and produced by Chris Attaway. This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a market intelligence company helping clients achieve resilient competitive advantage. Check out our website at www.re.co.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell a friend about it, and if you have a moment, rate us in your podcast app. Until next time, thanks for listening.